His German shepherd refused to let him leave the farm, but what the dog kept digging for had been hidden longer than anyone was supposed to remember. A rusted chain snapped against the barn door as Caleb spun toward the sound. Atlas clawed furiously through rotten floorboards, whining louder with every scrape. Rain soaked Caleb's jacket. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, and then cold steel appeared beneath the dirt. Before he could reach it, headlights swept across the hillside. Someone else had come for the same secret. What do you think was hidden under that barn? Caleb Foster stood at the edge of the gravel driveway, staring at the farmhouse as if it belonged to someone else's memory. The porch sagged toward the earth. Half the shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges. Tall weeds swallowed what had once been flower beds, and the old apple orchard beyond the fence looked more gray than green beneath the overcast September sky. Atlas stepped quietly beside him. The German shepherd's muzzle had turned almost completely silver over the years, but his eyes remained sharp, constantly studying every corner of the property. Even after retirement, the old military working dog still scanned every unfamiliar space before allowing Caleb to move forward. Caleb rested one weathered hand on Atlas's neck. "Looks like we both got old," Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail. The mountain wind carried the smell of wet leaves and pine through the Allegheny highlands. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled silently between layers of drifting fog. The place hadn't changed as much as Caleb expected, or maybe it had changed too much. He reached into his jacket and unfolded the letter from the county probate office for what felt like the 100th time. His Uncle Owen had died 6 weeks earlier. Massive heart attack. No wife, no children. No one left except Caleb. Along with the property came nearly $30,000 in unpaid taxes and maintenance fees. The numbers were impossible. Caleb had less than $400 in his checking account. Selling the farm wasn't a choice. It was survival. He folded the letter again and slipped it back into his pocket before climbing the porch steps. Every board groaned beneath his boots. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of cedar, dust, old coffee, and years of quiet. Nothing had been moved. Uncle Owen's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. A faded Army engineer cap hung from a hook near the kitchen door. The calendar on the wall remained open to the month he died. Time had simply stopped. Atlas padded slowly through each room with the patience of a trained search dog, nose close to the floor, occasionally pausing to sniff furniture that still carried Owen's scent. Caleb smiled faintly. "You remember him too, don't you?" Atlas looked back for a moment before continuing his slow inspection. Caleb walked toward the living room window. From there, he could see the old logging barn sitting nearly a quarter-mile away near the tree line. Its metal roof shimmered beneath the cloudy afternoon. A loose sheet of rusted tin suddenly slammed against the wooden frame. Clang! The sharp metallic crack echoed across the valley. Caleb froze. The room disappeared. Heat replaced cold. Dust filled the air. Another metallic blast. Another. His breathing shortened. His fingers curled automatically, as though reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. His eyes searched rooftops, windows, possible firing positions. Incoming? Where's the contact? The smell of smoke. The distant scream of rotors. Afghanistan. A convoy halted inside a narrow valley. The explosion had come from the second vehicle. Everything after that had become noise. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. Atlas moved instantly. The old shepherd stepped between Caleb and the window before pressing his shoulder firmly against Caleb's leg. One nudge, then another. Caleb blinked. The mountains slowly returned. The living room came back into focus. His breathing steadied little by little. He lowered himself into Owen's worn recliner, rubbing both hands over his face. "I'm here," he whispered to himself. "Not there." Atlas rested his head on Caleb's knee without making a sound. For nearly 2 years, moments like these had followed Caleb everywhere. A dropped pan, fireworks, construction equipment, even loose sheet metal on a windy afternoon. Doctors called them triggers. Caleb simply called them bad days. He scratched Atlas gently behind one ear. "You've saved me more times than I can count." Atlas closed his eyes for a moment. The silence inside the farmhouse felt almost comforting. As evening settled across the valley, Caleb walked outside carrying an old flashlight. He wanted one last look around before calling the realtor in the morning. The orchard stretched behind the house, rows of neglected apple trees climbing toward the hillsides, where Owen had once taught him to prune branches every spring. Most of the trees still stood. Many simply needed care. The farther Caleb walked, the more memories returned. Summer afternoons carrying buckets, fixing fences, learning how to split firewood, listening to Uncle Owen explain why every mountain deserved respect. "You don't conquer these hills," Owen used to say. "They decide whether you're welcome." Caleb smiled despite himself. Atlas wandered ahead through the tall grass before suddenly stopping. His ears lifted. His body stiffened. He wasn't looking toward the woods. He was staring directly at the old logging barn. The dog remained perfectly still, watching, waiting. Caleb followed his gaze. Only silence greeted them. The barn stood alone beneath the fading light, weathered and forgotten. Then Atlas let out one low growl, not loud, not frightened, a warning. Caleb frowned. "What is it, partner?" Atlas never took his eyes off the barn. Far beyond the property, almost hidden by the winding mountain road, headlights briefly appeared between the trees before disappearing again. Someone had driven past, or someone had stopped. Caleb couldn't tell which. But Atlas continued staring toward the barn long after the light was gone. For the first time since arriving, Caleb felt something far heavier than sadness settle over the mountain. It felt like the farm wasn't as abandoned as everyone believed. Atlas remained frozen, staring toward the old logging barn until darkness swallowed the ridge. Only after Caleb placed a hand on the dog's shoulder did he slowly turn away, though he glanced back twice before following him to the house. The next morning arrived wrapped in low fog that drifted between the hills like smoke. Caleb rose before sunrise, not because he had slept well, but because he rarely slept more than 3 hours at a time. Years after leaving Afghanistan, his body still obeyed habits it refused to forget. Wake before daylight. Check every exit. Listen before moving. He quietly crossed the living room, careful not to disturb Atlas. The old shepherd was already awake, watching the front door, always watching. Caleb poured instant coffee into a chipped mug Uncle Owen had probably owned for 20 years. The bitter taste reminded him of mornings inside plywood outposts where coffee was strong enough to keep soldiers alert through another patrol. He caught himself staring through the kitchen window toward the barn again. Nothing moved. No headlights. No strangers. Only morning mist hanging over the fields. By 8 o'clock, an unfamiliar black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel driveway. Atlas was on his feet before the engine stopped. The shepherd didn't bark. He simply walked forward and planted himself between Caleb and the vehicle. The driver's door opened. A tall man in his early 60s stepped out wearing polished boots that had never touched real mud. His expensive wool jacket looked strangely out of place against weathered fences and rusted equipment. He smiled before speaking. "Mr. Foster?" Caleb nodded. "I'm Victor Holloway." His handshake was firm but cold. "I was sorry to hear about your uncle." Caleb didn't answer. Victor glanced across the property with the confidence of someone who had already memorized every acre. "I understand you're considering selling. Word travels fast. Victor smiled again. It usually does in small counties. A younger man climbed out of the passenger side carrying a leather briefcase. My attorney, Victor said. Daniel Pierce. The attorney offered a polite nod before immediately studying the farmhouse instead of Caleb. Atlas shifted closer. His ears flattened. A low rumble escaped deep inside his chest. Victor looked down at the dog. Beautiful shepherd. He doesn't usually react like that. Caleb scratched Atlas behind the neck, but the dog refused to relax. Victor seemed amused. Animals are unpredictable. No, Caleb replied quietly. Atlas usually has a reason. For just a moment, Victor's smile weakened. Then it returned. I'll be direct. I'd like to purchase the property. You haven't even looked around. I already have. Caleb frowned. Victor continued. I own several parcels nearby. This farm fits nicely with future development. Caleb folded his arms. The realtor hasn't even listed it. I prefer solving problems before they become public. Daniel opened the briefcase and removed a neatly prepared purchase agreement. The offer is $380,000, he said. Caleb looked up. The number didn't make sense. The farmhouse needed major repairs. The orchard was dying. Most of the fences had collapsed. It was worth nowhere near that amount. Victor watched Caleb carefully. We can close tomorrow. Tomorrow? The paperwork is already prepared. Caleb looked from the contract back to Victor. You came awfully prepared for someone who just heard I inherited the place. Victor ignored the question. Instead, he looked toward the distant ridge. Tell me something. His tone became casual. Have you been inside the old logging barn yet? Caleb felt Atlas stiffen beside him. Why? Oh, no reason. Victor shrugged. Old structures can be dangerous. I'd hate to see you get hurt. Before Caleb could answer, another voice interrupted from across the fence. Morning, Caleb. An elderly woman carrying a bucket of apples approached from the neighboring pasture. She wore faded denim overalls beneath a thick flannel jacket, her silver hair tucked beneath a baseball cap. Victor's expression changed the instant he saw her. Martha Ellison, Caleb remembered aloud. She smiled warmly. You still remember me? I used to steal peaches from your trees. You weren't nearly as sneaky as you thought. She laughed before noticing Victor. Her smile disappeared. I didn't realize you had company. Victor tipped his head politely. Just discussing business. So I gathered. Martha's eyes lingered on the purchase papers. Then she looked directly at Caleb. If you have a minute later, I'd like to show you something before you sign anything. Victor answered before Caleb could. I'm sure Mr. Foster has everything under control. I'm sure he does, Martha replied. That's why I'm talking to him. Silence settled between them. Even the wind seemed to stop. Victor finally buttoned his jacket. My offer stands until tomorrow afternoon. He handed Caleb a business card. I'd advise not waiting too long. As Victor walked back toward the SUV, Atlas stepped forward with another low growl. Victor paused only once. Without turning around, he asked, One last question. Caleb waited. The logging barn. Victor spoke almost casually. The doors still locked? Caleb didn't answer. Victor climbed into the SUV. A few moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the mountain road. Martha watched until the dust settled. Then she quietly said, You're not the first person he's tried to buy out. Caleb looked at her. What do you mean? She stared toward the old logging barn. 6 families sold their land in the last 3 years. She paused. Every one of them owned property bordering that ridge. Atlas was already looking toward the barn again. This time, Caleb noticed something he had missed before. Fresh tire tracks curved through the damp grass near the old logging road. Someone had been there. Recently. Caleb crouched beside the fresh tire tracks, running 2 fingers across the damp soil. The edges hadn't softened from wind or rain. Whoever drove up the old logging road had done so within the last day. Atlas lowered his nose and followed the scent for several yards before stopping again. The dog didn't bark. He simply stared toward the weather-beaten logging barn perched beneath a stand of towering white pines. "That's twice you've picked that place," Caleb murmured. Atlas answered by taking another step toward it. Caleb glanced back toward the farmhouse. Victor Holloway's business card remained folded inside his shirt pocket, feeling heavier than a piece of paper should. Martha Ellison stood beside her fence, watching him from a distance. "Your uncle never liked strangers near that barn?" she called. Caleb looked up. "He ever tell you why?" She slowly shook her head. "Only that some things deserved to stay exactly where they belonged." She hesitated before adding quietly, "Owen wasn't afraid of much, but the last year or so, he started checking that ridge every evening before sunset." Caleb frowned. "You think he expected someone?" "I think he already knew someone was watching." The words lingered long after Martha walked home. That afternoon, Caleb wandered through the orchard, trimming dead limbs simply to keep his hands busy. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted back toward the ridge. Atlas never strayed far. Whenever Caleb paused, the shepherd quietly scanned the woods instead of chasing squirrels or rabbits like an ordinary farm dog. Old habits. Neither of them had truly retired. As dusk settled over the valley, Caleb unlocked the front door and stepped inside carrying a lantern. The farmhouse creaked softly as the mountain temperature dropped. He heated a can of beef stew on Owen's old gas stove, split half between himself and Atlas, then spread the purchase contract across the kitchen table. $380,000. Enough to erase every debt. Enough to stop sleeping in shelters. Enough to finally breathe again. His pen rested beside the contract. He reached for it. Instead, his eyes drifted toward a faded photograph hanging on the wall. A younger Owen stood beside Caleb's father, both wearing army uniforms stained with mud, smiling beside a temporary bridge somewhere in Vietnam. On the frame, Owen had carved 4 simple words years ago. "Stand your ground together." Caleb slowly lowered the pen. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. A cold rain began tapping against the roof. By midnight, the storm had settled directly over the valley. Lightning flashed through the windows every few minutes, filling the farmhouse with brief bursts of white light. Sleep never came. Caleb sat on the porch wrapped in Owen's old canvas jacket, while Atlas lay at his feet. Then another flash, another crack of thunder. For one heartbeat, it wasn't thunder. It was indirect fire. He smelled burning diesel, radio chatter, someone shouting coordinates. "Contact left." Caleb jerked upright, breathing hard. His right hand instinctively searched beside the chair for the rifle that hadn't been there in nearly 15 years. The rain came back first, then the porch, then Atlas. The shepherd stood and pressed against Caleb's legs until the trembling eased. "I'm good," Caleb whispered. "You already know I'm lying." Atlas remained exactly where he was. Minutes passed. The storm continued. Then the dog suddenly lifted his head. His ears locked forward. A deep growl rolled through his chest. Without waiting for Caleb, Atlas trotted off the porch and disappeared into the rain. "Atlas!" No response. Caleb grabbed the lantern and followed. The old dog moved with surprising speed despite his age, weaving between soaked apple trees toward the logging barn. Rain hammered the rusted metal roof. The enormous wooden doors remained chained shut exactly as Caleb had found them. Atlas ignored the front entrance. Instead, he circled behind the building, nose pressed close to the ground. Caleb struggled through waist-high weeds until he found him. Atlas was pawing furiously beneath one warped section of the rear floor where several rotten boards had begun separating from the foundation. "What is it?" The shepherd scratched harder. Again. Again. He stopped only long enough to look directly at Caleb before returning to the same spot. Years of working together had taught Caleb one lesson above all others. Atlas never insisted without a reason. Caleb set the lantern down. He searched the nearby wall until he found an old pry bar hanging from a rusted nail exactly where Owen had probably left it years earlier. He wedged the steel beneath the first loose board. The wood groaned, wrought cracked. One board lifted, then another. Beneath them lay nothing but darkness. Caleb lowered the lantern. Its yellow light revealed a narrow hidden cavity between the heavy floor beams. Something rested inside. Not wood, not stone. Green-painted steel. His heartbeat slowed into the steady rhythm he remembered before every patrol. He reached carefully into the opening. The object was surprisingly heavy. As he pulled it into the lantern light, decades of dust slid across the metal surface. An old military ammunition case, wrapped in faded oilcloth. Its brass latch was still locked. Atlas stopped scratching. He simply sat beside Caleb, watching the box as rain drummed steadily across the roof overhead. Somewhere beyond the barn, an engine started. Not close, but close enough. Caleb blew out the lantern in one quick breath. Darkness swallowed the barn. The engine idled somewhere beyond the trees for several seconds before fading into silence. Whoever had been on the logging road either turned around or shut the vehicle off. Atlas stood without making a sound. His ears tracked every faint movement beyond the walls. Caleb remained perfectly still. Years earlier, during night patrols in eastern Afghanistan, he'd learned that silence often revealed more than movement. A careless boot on loose gravel, a branch snapping under weight, a whispered voice carried by the wind. Nothing. Only rain tapping the rusted roof. After another minute, Caleb relit the lantern, shielding the flame with his hand. "We're not staying here long." He carried the heavy ammunition case into the farmhouse and locked the front door behind him. The steel box rested on Uncle Owen's kitchen table. Army green, scratched, scarred. The brass latch had darkened with age, but the rubber seal still looked intact. Whoever packed it intended the contents to survive. Caleb searched the utility drawer until he found a pair of bolt cutters hanging beneath old gardening tools. The lock resisted for a moment. Then, crack. The brass shackle snapped. Atlas lifted his head immediately. Caleb slowly opened the lid. A faint smell of cedar and machine oil drifted into the room. Inside, everything had been wrapped carefully in waxed cloth. The first bundle contained a thick parchment document protected inside a waterproof sleeve. Caleb unfolded it across the kitchen table. His eyes immediately settled on the embossed federal seal. United States Department of the Interior, land patent, issued in 1921. The original ownership document granting the mountain property to Owen's father after military service following the First World War. Caleb frowned. County records had shown a completely different deed. Why would Owen hide the original? Beneath it rested several yellowed survey maps marked with neat pencil notes. Certain property lines had been circled repeatedly. Entire boundary markers had been crossed out and replaced with handwritten measurements. None of it matched the official survey Caleb had received from the probate office. His pulse quickened. The next bundle contained letters. The first envelope carried familiar handwriting. For Caleb. Only open if I'm gone. His fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside rested a single handwritten page. Caleb. If you're reading this, then I waited too long. Some people believe old farms become valuable because of what's under the ground. They're wrong. This one became valuable because of what someone tried to erase. Don't trust county records. Don't trust anyone rushing you to sell. Start with the journals. Everything else will make sense afterward. Owen Caleb reached for the stack beneath it. Leather-bound notebooks. Every page filled in Owen's careful handwriting. The earliest entries described routine farm work, fence repairs, apple harvests, weather. But the later journals changed. October 14th. Saw another survey crew working the western ridge. Never asked permission. Claimed they were mapping utility corridors. They lied. October 22nd. Victor Holloway came again. Offered nearly twice what the land is worth. Didn't ask about the orchard. Didn't ask about the house. Only asked about the logging barn. He's hunting something. November 3rd. County records no longer match the original patent. Boundary markers have quietly disappeared. Somebody inside the recorder's office is helping them. Caleb stopped reading. The room suddenly felt smaller. Atlas stood and quietly walked toward the front window. The dog stared outside. Watching. Waiting. Caleb continued. November 19th. David would have understood this faster than I did. Your father always noticed patterns before anyone else. If they ever come after this farm, they're not after the buildings. They're after the deed. Protect it. The next journal contained folded photographs. Old stone survey monuments buried beneath leaves. Creek crossings. Forest markers. Each photograph carried dates spanning nearly 15 years. Owen had been documenting something. Patiently. Methodically. One final envelope rested beneath the journals. It contained military correspondence between Owen and Caleb's late father from decades earlier. Both men had served in Army engineering units, though in different wars. One sentence had been underlined twice. If the original patent disappears, every veteran family inside the Conservation Trust could lose their claim. Caleb stared at the words. Conservation Trust? He had never heard Owen mention one. He unfolded another survey map. This time he noticed dozens of neighboring farms outlined together. His uncle's property wasn't isolated at all. It connected every parcel surrounding the valley. Suddenly, Victor Holloway's urgency made perfect sense. The farm itself wasn't the prize. It was the key. Atlas growled. Low, sharp, different this time. Not suspicion. Warning. Caleb turned toward the kitchen window. Two narrow beams of white light slowly swept across the orchard. Not passing traffic. The lights stopped. Someone had pulled onto the property. Atlas stepped in front of the kitchen door. Outside, gravel crunched beneath heavy boots. Then came the unmistakable sound of a truck door closing. Another. Then another. Caleb quietly gathered the deed, journals, and survey maps back into the ammunition case. His ranger instincts returned without effort. Observe. Stay calm. Plan the exit before the contact. The porch boards creaked. Someone was climbing the steps. Caleb quietly closed the ammunition case and slid it beneath the kitchen table. Atlas stood motionless in front of the back hallway, every muscle tight beneath his aging coat. A heavy knock echoed through the farmhouse, not the polite knock of a neighbor. 3 hard strikes. Then silence. Another knock followed. Mr. Foster? A familiar voice called through the door. Victor Holloway. I know you're awake. Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he moved one step away from the window, keeping himself out of sight. The old instincts returned without thought. Never silhouette yourself against light. Never give away your position. Atlas watched the front entrance. His breathing remained slow. The porch creaked again. I'd like to apologize for stopping by so late, Victor continued. Something occurred to me after our conversation today. Another voice joined him. Lower, rougher. Maybe he already left. Caleb eased toward the side window and lifted one corner of the curtain less than an inch. 3 men. Victor stood beneath the porch light with an umbrella. Beside him was a broad-shouldered man wearing a dark rain jacket despite the warm night. His thick beard couldn't hide the old scar running from one ear to his jaw. Dean Rollins, the security chief. The third man was shorter, carrying a metal survey case over one shoulder. Not a lawyer. Not tonight. A survey consultant. Victor smiled toward the front door. I won't take much of your time. No answer. Victor looked toward Dean. Dean stepped off the porch and slowly circled the house. Atlas immediately turned his head, tracking him. Caleb whispered, "Back." Atlas obeyed, though reluctantly. Dean stopped outside the kitchen window. His flashlight swept across the sink, across the cabinets, across the empty table. Caleb had already stepped deeper into the shadows. The beam passed only inches away before moving on. Dean spoke quietly into a handheld radio. No visual. Victor remained calm. "Mr. Foster," he called again. "I brought revised paperwork. We've increased the offer." Still no response. Victor sighed dramatically. "I understand grief, but tomorrow other buyers may complicate things. I'd hate for paperwork to become difficult." Caleb's jaw tightened. This wasn't about buying land. This was about getting inside the house. Dean reached the rear porch. The old screen door rattled, locked. He tested the handle once, then twice. Atlas's lips curled back. A low growl filled the hallway. Dean froze. Victor turned. "Dog?" "Inside." Victor nodded slowly. "So he is home." Caleb's pulse remained steady, his breathing slow. "Observe. Count. 3 men. 1 vehicle. No obvious firearms, no backup visible. The rain covered small sounds. Good." Dean suddenly aimed his flashlight toward the distant logging barn. "Boss." Victor followed the beam. "The rear door. It looks open." Caleb felt his stomach sink. He had left it that way after retrieving the ammunition case. Victor's expression changed. Completely. The polite businessman disappeared. "What are you waiting for?" he snapped. Dean and the surveyor hurried toward the barn. Victor remained on the porch for only another second before following them through the rain. Atlas looked at Caleb. The dog didn't need commands. He already understood. Caleb grabbed the ammunition case, wrapped the journals inside Owen's old canvas field jacket, slung everything over one shoulder. He quietly unlocked the back door. Outside, darkness covered the orchard. The rain had softened to a mist. Every step disappeared into wet grass. Atlas moved ahead, weaving silently between trees. Not running. Leading. Caleb followed. Years earlier, rangers had called it bounding by terrain. Move. Pause. Observe. Move again. The orchard gave way to a narrow trail leading behind the logging barn. Voices echoed from inside. "They've been here!" Dean shouted. "Floor's open!" Victor's reply came sharp and furious. "Find him!" Flashlights burst through broken windows. White beams swept across the hillside. Atlas suddenly stopped. His ears locked toward the creek. Caleb listened. Voices behind. Water ahead. One narrow option. The forgotten livestock tunnel. As children, he and Uncle Owen had crawled through it, while repairing drainage beneath the barn. Most people never knew it existed. Caleb dropped onto one knee beside tangled blackberry vines. There, half hidden beneath years of brush, a stone opening barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. He pulled the branches aside. "Come on, partner." Atlas entered first without hesitation. Caleb shoved the ammunition case ahead of him and crawled into the damp tunnel. Cold earth pressed against his shoulders. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Behind them, voices grew louder. "They're close!" A flashlight beam suddenly pierced the tunnel entrance. Dean had found the opening. "Hurry!" someone yelled. Atlas crawled faster. The shepherd emerged first through the opposite side near the creek bank. Caleb pushed the heavy case through after him. As he squeezed through the final narrow gap, Atlas yelped. A jagged piece of rusted metal hidden beneath the collapsed exit scraped deeply across his right shoulder. Dark blood immediately soaked into his wet fur. The dog stumbled, then stood again. Without hesitation, Atlas limped forward and turned back toward Caleb, waiting, refusing to leave him behind. Caleb pressed one hand gently against the wound. Easy. Blood covered his fingers. The cut was deep, but Atlas never looked at his own injury. His eyes stayed fixed on the woods behind them, watching for pursuit. Seconds later, angry voices erupted from the tunnel entrance they had just escaped. Dean shouted, "They came this way!" Flashlights burst through the trees. Caleb tightened his grip on the ammunition case. There was no turning back now. He slipped one arm beneath Atlas's chest and gently checked the wound along the dog's shoulder. The cut was long, but the bleeding wasn't pulsing. Not an artery. That was the first good news he'd had all night. He pulled a compression bandage from the small first aid pouch he still carried everywhere. Old habits had outlived his military career. "Hold still, partner." Atlas didn't flinch. The shepherd watched the tree line while Caleb wrapped the bandage around his shoulder with practiced hands. 15 years had passed since his last deployment, yet muscle memory guided every movement. Pressure, wrap, tie, check circulation. The bleeding slowed. Behind them, flashlight beams bounced wildly through the woods. "They're heading toward the creek!" Dean Rollins's voice echoed between the hills. Caleb immediately looked uphill instead. Too predictable. If he were leading the pursuit, he'd push the target downhill toward open ground. He wasn't going to make that easy. "Come on." Atlas rose carefully, favoring his injured leg, but refusing help. Together they climbed the narrow ridge hidden beneath towering hemlocks. The higher they climbed, the thicker the fog became. Moonlight barely reached the forest floor. Caleb paused every 50 yards. Observe. Listen. Move. His breathing stayed controlled despite the steep climb. Each stop reminded him of countless patrols through Afghanistan's eastern mountains, where rushing ahead usually meant walking into someone else's plan. A distant mechanical hum drifted across the valley. Caleb stopped instantly. Atlas froze beside him. The sound grew louder. A drone. Small. Civilian. Probably equipped with thermal imaging. Victor wasn't simply chasing him. He had prepared for this. The drone appeared above the treetops, its blinking lights barely visible through the mist. Caleb scanned the terrain. Large boulders, dense evergreen canopy, cold creek below. He quietly motioned toward a cluster of massive sandstone outcroppings. The rocks would mask their body heat long enough for the drone to pass. Atlas followed without hesitation. They settled beneath an overhanging ledge just as the drone floated overhead. Its faint electric buzz stirred painful memories. The sound blended with another. Rotor blades. A black hawk circling above a dusty valley. Someone shouting for a medical evacuation. The air smelled of smoke again. Caleb's vision narrowed. His hands trembled. For one terrifying moment, he wasn't beneath Pennsylvania pines. He was back inside a shattered compound, kneeling beside a wounded soldier whose name he still couldn't say aloud. The buzzing grew louder. Atlas leaned against him, firm, steady. The weight of the old shepherd slowly anchored him. Caleb closed his eyes. Count your breathing. 4 in, 4 out. You're here, not there. The flashback faded. When he opened his eyes, the drone had already disappeared into the darkness. He gently scratched Atlas behind one ear. You always know. The dog blinked slowly. As dawn approached, they reached an abandoned fire road winding along the mountain's eastern slope. Caleb recognized it immediately. Uncle Owen used to drive old logging trucks here decades earlier. Most maps no longer showed the road. Good. The ammunition case grew heavier with every mile. His knees ached. His lower back burned. Age had stolen speed, but not determination. Atlas suddenly stopped again. His nose lifted into the morning air. Not danger. Something else. Helicopters. 2 National Guard Blackhawks appeared far beyond the western ridge, flying routine mountain training exercises. The rhythmic thump of their rotors rolled through the valleys. Caleb immediately crouched. His breathing shortened. His heartbeat accelerated before he could stop it. His eyes searched automatically for cover. Old instincts refused to distinguish training aircraft from combat. Atlas quietly sat beside him until the helicopters disappeared beyond the mountains. Only then did Caleb stand. I hate that sound. He wasn't speaking to Atlas. He was speaking to ghosts. Hours later, they reached an overlook where nearly the entire valley stretched below. Caleb pulled a pair of compact binoculars from Owen's field jacket. The farmhouse stood empty in the distance. Several black SUVs surrounded the property. Men moved between the orchard, the logging barn, and nearby fields. Others searched on TVs, spreading outward in organized patterns. Victor wasn't improvising. He was directing sectors, searching grid by grid, like an infantry sweep. Caleb lowered the binoculars. They're treating this like a military operation. Atlas quietly growled. Then Caleb noticed something else. Fresh tire tracks clasped another mountain road leading north, toward the old ranger cabins, toward the one place Uncle Owen had mentioned repeatedly in his journals. Elias Boone. If anyone could explain the documents inside the ammunition case, it would be Owen's oldest friend. Caleb adjusted the heavy case across his shoulder. That's where we're going. Atlas rose beside him despite the pain in his injured shoulder. One man, one aging dog, an entire mountain between them and the truth. Far below, Victor Holloway stepped out of one of the SUVs and looked slowly toward the northern ridges, almost as if he already knew exactly where Caleb would run next. Caleb lowered the binoculars. If he guesses right once, he said quietly, we don't give him a second chance. Atlas gave a soft huff and started forward. The old fire road climbed through dense hemlocks before disappearing into a forest that hadn't changed much since Caleb was a boy. Fallen logs lay across forgotten trails, moss-covered weathered stone walls, and sunlight barely reached the ground beneath the thick canopy. By late afternoon, they found the cabin. It sat beside a narrow stream beneath towering maples, built from hand-cut timber that had turned silver with age. Smoke drifted lazily from a stone chimney. Someone was home. Caleb stopped 20 yards away. He didn't announce himself immediately. Instead, he watched. A habit formed long before retirement. The front door opened. An elderly man with broad shoulders stepped onto the porch carrying an armload of split firewood. His beard was white, but the way he balanced the weight suggested quiet strength remained. The man noticed Atlas first, then Caleb. He slowly set the firewood down. I wondered how long it would take, he said. Caleb frowned. You know who I am? Elias Boone. The old man offered a tired smile. I promised Owen I'd recognize you before you recognized me. Caleb stepped onto the porch. You knew my uncle. For 48 years. Elias looked at the ammunition case. And I see you found what he hid. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, coffee, and old books. Maps covered one wall, forest surveys, watershed charts, aerial photographs, and decades of handwritten notes filled shelves that stretched nearly to the ceiling. Atlas settled beside the fireplace while Elias carefully examined the original land patent. He nodded slowly. It's real. I never doubted that. Caleb unfolded the county survey beside it. The boundaries don't match. They weren't supposed to. Elias removed an old rolled map from a wooden cabinet. Its paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained sharp. This, he said, spreading it across the table, is the original conservation survey. Caleb leaned closer. His eyes widened. The map showed not one property, but 23. Every farm surrounding the valley connected through a protected conservation trust established nearly a century earlier. The trust had been created by veterans returning from World War I. Families who had received neighboring land grants agreed that none of the parcels could ever be divided or consolidated without the original patent documents. If one deed disappeared, Caleb said quietly, the entire chain could be broken. Elias nodded. And if someone quietly altered enough county records, they could claim the land was abandoned. Exactly. Caleb stared at the valley outlined across the map. This isn't just my farm. No. Elias looked directly into his eyes. It's thousands of acres. He pointed toward several handwritten notes. Protected forests, family farms, natural springs, historic logging rights, wildlife corridors. If Victor controls your deed, he controls everything tied to it. Caleb slowly sat back. Victor hadn't been chasing a farmhouse. He'd been chasing the one document preventing decades of fraudulent land transfers. Elias reached for another folder. Owen suspected this almost 15 years ago. Inside were photographs of disappearing stone boundary markers, copies of survey discrepancies, letters sent to county offices. Most had never received replies. He kept digging, Elias said. The closer he got, the more pressure he faced. The offers? The threats. Caleb looked up. Threats? Elias nodded. Nothing obvious. Broken fences. Equipment damaged. People watching the property. He refused to leave. Atlas suddenly stood. His ears locked toward the window. A low growl rolled through the cabin. Elias quietly walked to the curtain, only enough to look through one corner. His expression hardened. They found us. 2 dark SUVs had stopped on the narrow forest road below the cabin. Men climbed out carrying radios. Dean Rollins stepped into the clearing and studied the tire tracks leading to Elias's porch. He smiled, slowly, confidently. Victor climbed from the second vehicle a moment later. He looked directly toward the cabin, almost as if he knew the conversation inside had already revealed the truth. Elias rolled the map shut with surprising calm. There's something else Owen wanted you to know. He walked to the stone fireplace and rested one hand on the mantel. This cabin, he pressed against a loose timber beside the hearth. A hidden compartment quietly opened inside the wall, was built with another way out. Outside, truck doors slammed. Heavy footsteps began climbing toward the porch. Elias Boone calmly reached into the hidden compartment behind the stone fireplace. Instead of pulling out a weapon, he removed a weathered canvas satchel stuffed with folders, notebooks, and several sealed envelopes. Owen told me this day would probably come, he said quietly. He handed the satchel to Caleb. If we lose these, we lose more than your farm. Atlas stood beside the concealed opening in the wall, his ears fixed on the front door. 3 heavy knocks echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Boone." Victor Holloway's voice sounded calm. "I know you're inside." Silence. Dean Rollins tried the doorknob. Locked. Victor spoke again. "This doesn't need to become unpleasant." Elias smiled faintly. "Funny," he whispered. "That's exactly what Owen said Victor always sounded like." He stepped into the narrow passage hidden behind the fireplace. This tunnel follows the creek for nearly 300 yards. Built during Prohibition. Smugglers used it. Now it'll keep honest people alive. Caleb followed, carrying the ammunition case in one hand and the satchel over his shoulder. Atlas slipped in behind them. The passage was narrow, damp, and lined with rough stone. Water trickled beside their boots as they moved through darkness, guided only by Elias's small flashlight. Behind them came the sound of splintering wood. The front door had given way. Voices flooded the cabin. "They're gone! Search every room!" Dean's footsteps pounded overhead. Elias didn't slow. "They'll find the passage eventually. Not before we're out." Several minutes later, they emerged behind a curtain of thick rhododendron overlooking the stream below. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees. For the first time in hours, Caleb took a full breath. But Elias wasn't looking relieved. He was looking worried. "We have another problem." He opened one of the sealed envelopes. Inside were copies of official county property records. Every page carried certification stamps. These came from someone inside the recorder's office. Caleb studied them. His original property boundaries had been quietly altered over several years. Dates changed, survey references disappeared, entire parcels reassigned. Each revision looked perfectly legal, until compared with Owen's originals. Who signed these? Elias pointed toward a familiar name. Linda Brooks, Deputy County Recorder. Caleb frowned. "I met her when I filed probate paperwork. Friendly, helpful." Elias nodded. "She's also the last person Owen trusted." Caleb looked up. "What happened?" "Victor happened." Elias folded the papers carefully. She had access. He had money. The county never questioned the changes because every revision looked routine. Caleb stared across the valley. "She's been rewriting history. For years." Atlas suddenly raised his head. He sniffed the breeze, then walked directly toward the edge of the trees overlooking the forest road. His posture changed instantly. Rigid. Alert. Caleb lifted the binoculars. A white county SUV slowly climbed toward the cabin. County seal on the door. Linda Brooks stepped out. She wasn't alone. Victor's black SUV followed only seconds behind. Caleb watched as Linda spoke briefly with Victor. She handed him a folder. Victor opened it. Smiled. Then both looked toward the forest. Toward the creek. Toward the exact direction of the tunnel exit. "They know," Caleb said quietly. Elias's expression darkened. "No." They guessed. Before either man could move, Dean Rollins pointed toward the stream. "There!" The shout echoed across the valley. Atlas barked once, sharp, urgent. Victor immediately waved his men forward. "They're heading downstream." The search team spread out with surprising discipline. 2 moved along the creek. Others climbed both ridges. "They're boxing us in," Caleb observed. Elias nodded. "They've learned these mountains." "No." Caleb adjusted the satchel across his shoulder. "They learned from someone who already knew them." Linda Brooks climbed back into the county SUV, without looking once toward the men entering the woods. She drove away as if nothing unusual had happened. as if she had simply delivered ordinary paperwork. Caleb watched the vehicle disappear. Betrayal settled deeper than anger. His uncle had spent years trying to protect families who trusted their own county records. Someone sworn to preserve those records had quietly erased them instead. Atlas suddenly turned away from the approaching search teams. He wasn't looking behind them. He was staring farther north, toward an abandoned fire tower standing high above the valley. Elias followed the dog's gaze. There are old Forest Service radio lines up there. He looked at Caleb. If we can reach the tower, we may finally have a way to prove everything. Behind them, Victor's search teams were already closing the distance. The mountain had become far too small. "Keep moving," Elias said. The three of them followed a narrow game trail that climbed toward the abandoned fire tower. The slope grew steeper with every step, forcing Caleb to lean against exposed roots and weathered rocks. Atlas limped beside him. The bandage around the shepherd's shoulder had darkened with blood, yet the old dog never drifted behind. Every few yards he stopped, looked back down the mountain, and then urged Caleb forward with a quiet nudge. "He should be resting," Caleb said. Elias glanced at Atlas. "He'll rest when he believes you're safe." Those words settled heavily in Caleb's chest. By midday, they reached a narrow gorge carved by decades of rushing spring water. A fallen oak stretched across the gap, forming a natural bridge no wider than 2 feet. The stream below crashed against boulders 30 feet beneath them. Elias crossed first, moving carefully despite his age. Caleb followed, balancing the ammunition case against his shoulder while gripping the rough bark with one hand. Atlas waited until Caleb reached the opposite side. Then the shepherd stepped onto the log. Halfway across, voices echoed through the trees behind them. "There!" Dean Rollins pointed toward the gorge. Victor and 2 other men emerged from the forest, less than 100 yards away. Victor raised a hand. "Caleb!" His voice carried clearly across the canyon. "You don't have to keep running." Caleb ignored him. Dean started around the edge of the gorge, searching for another crossing. Victor remained where he stood. "You've already seen enough to know this isn't ending the way you hope." Caleb turned only long enough to answer. "It already ended for you the day Owen kept that deed." Victor's expression hardened. "You have no idea what's at stake." "I know exactly what's at stake." Caleb tightened his grip on the ammunition case. "It belongs to the families who earned it." Victor didn't answer. Instead, he nodded once toward Dean. Dean disappeared into the trees. Atlas had nearly reached the far side of the log when a sharp crack echoed through the gorge. Not a gunshot. A branch. One of the rotten support limbs beneath the fallen oak finally gave way. The entire trunk lurched violently. Atlas lost his footing. The shepherd slipped sideways, his injured shoulder striking the bark before he slid toward the rushing water below. "Atlas!" Without thinking, Caleb dropped the ammunition case and lunged forward. He caught the dog's harness with both hands, just before Atlas disappeared over the edge. The sudden weight nearly pulled Caleb off the log as well. His boots scraped helplessly against wet bark. Below them, white water crashed between jagged rocks. "Hold on!" Caleb shouted. Atlas didn't struggle. He simply looked up at Caleb, trusting him completely. Elias hurried back across the log, dropping flat on his stomach. "Give me your arm!" Caleb couldn't. Both hands gripped Atlas's harness. His shoulders burned. His fingers slowly began slipping. Years vanished in an instant. Another cliff. Another soldier hanging above a rocky ravine. Another moment he had never forgiven himself for. Not again. Not this time. With a burst of strength, Elias reached forward and grabbed Caleb's jacket. "Now!" Together they pulled. Inch by inch, Atlas climbed high enough to find purchase with his front paws. The old shepherd scrambled onto the log and collapsed against Caleb. Only then did Caleb notice fresh blood soaking through the bandage. The reopened wound stretched farther across Atlas's shoulder. Caleb immediately opened his medical pouch. His hands moved with practiced precision. Sterile gauze. Pressure dressing. Wrap. Secure. Atlas whimpered once but never pulled away. Easy, partner. Caleb rested his forehead gently against the dog's. You've carried me enough. When the bleeding finally slowed, Atlas licked Caleb's hand. Behind them, Victor's men reached the opposite side of the gorge. The damaged log had shifted too far for an immediate crossing. Dean searched for another route, frustration plain on his face. Victor simply watched from across the rushing water. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked patient, as though he believed time itself would eventually defeat Caleb. Elias quietly lifted the ammunition case. We have to go. Caleb nodded. Without hesitation, he bent down and slipped one arm beneath Atlas's chest. The old shepherd tried to stand on his own. You've done enough. Caleb gently lifted him into his arms. Atlas rested his head against Caleb's shoulder without protest. The climb toward the abandoned fire tower grew steeper, but Caleb never slowed. Every step hurt. Every breath burned. Yet the weight in his arms reminded him exactly why he could not stop. Far below, Victor Holloway watched the three figures disappear into the trees. Then he calmly reached for his phone. We know where they're heading, he said. Get everyone to the fire tower before they do. Victor slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked once more toward the northern ridge. This ends today. Miles away, Caleb heard nothing but the wind. The abandoned fire tower stood above the Allegheny Highlands, like a forgotten sentinel. Its weathered steel frame rose above the pines, overlooking nearly every valley Uncle Owen had spent his life protecting. By the time Caleb, Atlas, and Elias reached the clearing, the afternoon sun had begun sinking behind the western mountains. Caleb gently lowered Atlas onto a patch of soft grass. You stay. Atlas tried to rise. No. The old shepherd reluctantly settled back down, though his eyes never left the surrounding woods. Elias unlocked the tower's rusted maintenance shed, with a small brass key hidden beneath a loose stone. I wasn't sure this would still work. The old padlock clicked open. Inside sat dusty shelves, obsolete Forest Service equipment, and a heavy metal cabinet filled with forgotten radio hardware. Elias smiled faintly. Not everything here is obsolete. He reached behind the cabinet and pulled out a weatherproof storage case. Inside rested a rugged satellite transmitter, spare batteries, and a portable document scanner. Owen insisted we keep backups. Caleb looked at him in surprise. He planned for this? He planned for the possibility that no one would believe paper records alone. Together they carefully removed the original deed, Owen's journals, survey maps, photographs, and every altered county record connected to Linda Brooks. Elias powered on the transmitter. Its screen flickered to life. Signal? Strong enough. Caleb fed each document through the portable scanner. The machine hummed steadily, while digital copies appeared on the display. One file after another. Original land patent, conservation trust agreement, boundary surveys, journal entries, photographic evidence, county alterations. Every piece formed another link in a chain that Victor had spent years trying to erase. Elias connected the transmitter. We only get one clean upload. Caleb nodded. Who receives it? Everyone. Elias entered a prepared contact list. Federal Land Investigators, the Veterans Land Preservation Foundation, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's Office, several investigative journalists Owen had quietly trusted, multiple secure legal archives. Ready. Caleb pressed the transmit button. A progress bar slowly crawled across the screen. 10%. 25. 40. Atlas suddenly stood. A sharp bark shattered the quiet. Caleb turned. Black SUVs burst into the clearing below. Victor had arrived. Dean Rollins and several men spread through the trees, cutting off every obvious escape route. Victor stepped into the open. "You've done enough running." Caleb calmly closed the scanner. "We're done running." Victor looked toward the satellite transmitter. His smile disappeared. "What have you done?" Caleb answered without raising his voice. "The truth." Victor took several quick steps forward. "Turn it off." No one moved. The progress bar reached 65%. Dean looked toward Victor. "They're transmitting something." "I can see that!" Victor shouted. He pointed toward the tower. "Get up there!" Dean and two men rushed toward the staircase. Before they reached it, Atlas limped forward and planted himself at the base of the first step. The old shepherd didn't attack. He simply stood there. Head lowered, eyes locked on the approaching men. Dean hesitated. He had seen military dogs before. He knew exactly what one determined shepherd could do. The brief pause was enough. 82%, 91. Victor looked up at Caleb. "You have no idea how much this project is worth." Caleb met his eyes. "My uncle never measured land by money." 98. Victor reached for his phone. Almost instantly, it began vibrating in his hand. Then another phone rang. Dean's. Another man checked his screen. The silence spread from one face to another. Victor slowly looked down. Breaking news alert. Multiple federal agencies announce investigation into alleged land fraud involving protected veteran conservation properties. Another notification appeared. Emergency preservation orders filed. Property transfers suspended. Federal investigators dispatched. More alerts flooded every phone in the clearing. The upload reached 100%. Transmission complete. Elias quietly exhaled. "It's out." Caleb looked across the valley. Somewhere far below, sirens echoed faintly along the winding mountain roads. Not local patrol cars. Several vehicles. Approaching fast. Victor stared at his phone in complete silence. For the first time since Caleb had met him, he looked afraid. Victor Holloway stared at the alerts lighting up his phone. The confidence that had carried him through every conversation vanished. Around him, his men exchanged uneasy glances as their own devices chimed one after another. Dean Rollins lowered his radio. "Boss." Victor looked toward the valley road. The distant sirens were growing louder. "They're early," he muttered. "They weren't supposed to know this fast." Caleb said nothing. He simply rested one hand on Atlas's neck. The old shepherd leaned against his leg, exhausted but still standing despite the pain in his injured shoulder. Elias quietly closed the weatherproof case containing the original deed. "We've done what Owen hoped someone would eventually do." The first vehicles appeared below the fire tower. Not black SUVs, government vehicles. Several marked trucks from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office climbed the gravel road, followed by federal investigators and state conservation officers. Behind them came local deputies. The clearing, so empty only minutes earlier, suddenly filled with flashing blue and amber lights. No one rushed. No one shouted. The investigators moved with calm purpose. A woman wearing a federal field jacket stepped toward Caleb. "I'm Special Agent Rachel Monroe." She held up her identification before speaking again. "We received the document archive and verified enough information to obtain emergency preservation orders." She looked toward Victor. "Mr. Holloway, we need to speak with you." Victor forced a smile. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Agent Monroe didn't respond. Instead, Another investigator approached carrying a folder. "We've already compared the uploaded deed with federal land records." He looked directly at Victor. "The signatures match. The county revisions do not." Linda Brooks arrived only moments later in another county vehicle. She stepped out, looking confused, her face draining of color as she saw the number of investigators waiting. One deputy approached her quietly. "Ms. Brooks, we'd like to ask you several questions regarding historical property filings." She looked toward Victor. He looked away. For the first time, she realized she was standing alone. Caleb watched silently as years of deception unraveled without raised voices or dramatic confrontations. Documents spoke louder than accusations. Facts carried more weight than anger. Agent Monroe turned toward Caleb. "Mr. Foster, your uncle documented this exceptionally well. He never stopped believing someone would finish it." Caleb looked down at the weathered ammunition case. "He did the hard part. I just opened the lid." Over the following weeks, investigators remained throughout the valley. Survey teams uncovered original stone boundary markers exactly where Owen's journals had described them. Federal archives confirmed the conservation trust established by returning veterans after World War I. County records were corrected. Fraudulent transfers were suspended. Families who had feared losing land their grandparents had farmed for generations received letters confirming their ownership had been restored. Martha Ellison stood outside her farmhouse one afternoon watching new survey markers being placed. When Caleb drove past in Owen's old pickup, she raised a hand. "I never thought I'd live long enough to see this." Caleb smiled. Neither did Owen. Word spread quickly through the surrounding counties. Neighbors who had barely spoken in years gathered again beneath church pavilions and community halls. Old photographs were brought out. Stories were shared. Children listened as veterans explained why their families had settled these mountains a century earlier. The valley remembered itself. Several weeks later, a representative from a national development company quietly withdrew every pending purchase connected to Victor Holloway's project. Without the altered deeds, nothing remained to support the plan. The mountains would stay exactly where they belonged. One cool October morning, Caleb stood beneath the old apple trees with Atlas resting beside him. The orchard was beginning to show signs of life. Young green shoots pushed from branches everyone had believed were dead. Martha walked across the field carrying a basket. "I heard someone offered you several $1 million after all this." Caleb laughed softly. "More money than I've ever seen." "And?" He looked across the valley. At the farms, the forests, the families working fields beneath the autumn sun. "I already inherited everything I need." Atlas slowly rose and leaned against Caleb's leg. His limp remained, but every day it grew a little stronger. Caleb scratched behind the shepherd's ears. "We're going home." As they walked toward the farmhouse together, the afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay across the valley. For the first time in many years, the mountain felt peaceful. Winter came quietly to the Allegheny Highlands. Snow gathered along the fence posts, settled across the orchard, and softened the scars left by months of uncertainty. The old farmhouse no longer looked abandoned. Fresh paint covered the weathered porch. Broken windows had been replaced. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney every morning. Caleb stood outside before sunrise with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Atlas rested beside him. The old German shepherd still carried a slight limp in his right shoulder, a reminder of the day the mountain nearly claimed them both. The veterinarian had warned that age and injury would always leave a mark. Caleb didn't mind. Neither did Atlas. Some scars deserved to remain. By early spring, the orchard awakened. Tiny green buds appeared across branches everyone had once believed were beyond saving. Volunteers from neighboring farms arrived almost every weekend. Some repaired fences. Others rebuilt the old logging barn. Several local veterans installed new beams where rot had nearly brought the structure down. Caleb insisted on preserving one section of the original floor. The hidden compartment beneath it remained exactly as Uncle Owen had built it. Not to hide secrets anymore, but to remember why the truth had survived. Inside the farmhouse, the ammunition case rested inside a glass display cabinet. Beside it lay the original land patent, Owen's journals, the survey maps, a framed photograph of Owen and Caleb's father in uniform. Below them, a small brass plaque carried a simple inscription. They protected this land so others could call it home. News of the restored conservation trust spread well beyond the valley. Families whose grandparents had settled the mountains returned for reunions. Children wandered through orchards their ancestors had planted. Retired service members volunteered to repair barns, trails, and bridges that had slowly fallen into disrepair. One afternoon, Agent Rachel Monroe stopped by the farm. She walked through the orchard with Caleb while Atlas trotted slowly ahead, stopping every few minutes to sniff the spring air. "I thought you'd be traveling by now," she said. "You've had plenty of offers." Caleb smiled. "I spent too many years looking for somewhere to belong." He glanced toward the farmhouse. "I finally found it." Rachel nodded. "The foundation approved your proposal." Caleb looked at her. "They did?" She handed him a folder. "The old farm will officially become the Owen Foster Veterans Retreat." Caleb opened the papers. Local counselors had volunteered. Nearby hospitals offered support. The county agreed to maintain the access road. Veterans dealing with PTSD would have a quiet place to recover, surrounded by forests instead of concrete walls. Caleb looked across the valley. "I think Owen would have liked that. I think he planned for it." Construction began that summer. The guest cabins remained simple. Nothing luxurious. Just sturdy buildings overlooking the mountains, with walking trails winding through the woods Uncle Owen had spent decades protecting. Some veterans came for a weekend. Others stayed longer. No one was asked to explain their nightmares. Everyone understood. On cool evenings, Caleb often sat on the rebuilt porch, watching the sunset paint the ridges in shades of gold and deep blue. Atlas always claimed the same spot beside the front steps. Children visiting with their grandparents loved throwing tennis balls across the yard. The old shepherd no longer chased them with the speed he once had. Instead, he trotted after each throw with quiet dignity before proudly carrying the ball back. The children laughed every single time. Their laughter echoed through the valley where fear had once lived. Late one afternoon, Caleb walked alone to the old logging barn. He opened the familiar wooden doors and stepped inside. The restored beams smelled of fresh-cut pine. Sunlight streamed through the high windows. He knelt beside the preserved section of floor where Atlas had first begun scratching months earlier. "So this was your last mission." His voice barely rose above a whisper. He rested one hand on the weathered boards. "Thank you, Uncle Owen." A gentle breeze drifted through the open doorway. Outside, Atlas barked once. Not a warning, just a familiar invitation. Caleb smiled. "I'm coming." He stepped back into the afternoon sunlight. Atlas waited patiently at the edge of the orchard. Beyond them stretched rows of healthy apple trees, neighboring farms alive with families, and mountains that would remain protected for generations to come. Caleb slipped one hand into his jacket pocket, feeling the smooth edge of the small brass key Uncle Owen had left behind. He no longer carried it because he feared losing something. He carried it because it reminded him that some doors were meant to be opened only by those willing to protect what waited on the other side. Together, Caleb and Atlas walked slowly toward the farmhouse. The porch light glowed warmly beneath the evening sky. For the first time since returning home, Caleb realized he was no longer counting exits, scanning rooftops, or waiting for danger to appear. He was simply walking home, and for the first time in many years, home was waiting for him. Maybe that's what this story was really about. Not hidden deeds, not forgotten land, not even the mountain. It was about discovering that home isn't just a place you inherit. It's something you protect, something you rebuild, and sometimes, something that patiently waits for you to find your way back. If Caleb and Atlas's journey meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Just comment 1 if you believe loyalty can change a person's life, or comment 0 if you think everyone deserves a second chance, no matter how difficult their past has been. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd truly love to know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, hope, loyal dogs, and ordinary people overcoming impossible odds, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another unforgettable journey waiting for you in the very next story. Until then, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and never underestimate the difference one loyal heart can make.